Griff's Library presents The Dusters, one of 3 audio stories connected to Slater and the Goliath. Chapter 1. A glint of light shimmered in Apollo's eyes as he stared at his finding, another beautiful discovery. "Guys, check this one out," he said excitedly. Evie and Brody set their brushes in the sand and kneeled next to their brother. "Whoa!" Evie chimed. The 3 wore sun cloaks and wide-brimmed hats. Rays from the orange sun filtered through the thin cloud cover, heating the sands of Nielsen V. Of the 5 planets to orbit the system's sun, only their planet was able to sustain life. It was the Nielsen system, so someone decided it should be called Nielsen V. Unoriginal. Silly, depending on who you asked. Brody would have preferred a different name, something with some oomph. Starblade, Fire Slasher, Butt Kicker 2. He had to assume Butt Kicker 1 was already taken. Evie would have gone with something bright, something with pizzazz. Happy Shiny Glitz World, something like that. Boring or not, Apollo loved it, the planet and its name. Why did Apollo love this barren desert of a world? Most people complained about the lack of sweeping oceans. They grew bored of the sand, some even stating that they didn't like the sand because it's coarse and rough and irritating and it gets everywhere. They coveted the lush rainforests of other worlds or caves that ran miles into the ground like others had, or even snow-peaked mountains. Nielsen V had none of that. So what did it have? Bones. Lots and lots of bones. You might be thinking, bones? Who cares about old crusty bones? Well, Apollo did, as did his brother and his sister. But let's be clear about this. These were not just any bones. These were dinosaur bones. Nielsen V had once been home to all species of Jurassic monsters, and these bones were valuable. Some more than others, but far and away the bone game was the most valuable trade that the planet could offer. Nielsen V had no gold or silver, no pearls or diamonds, just bones. Well, that's not entirely true. There were rumors of ancient minerals hidden underground, but the planet had made a name for itself on the bone thing. Brody peered down at the jawbones, half buried in the sandpit. "What kind is it? Can you tell me?" he asked. Apollo nodded. His favorite part of the dig was identifying the species. "It's a Bobosaurus, I'm 99% sure." He then reached for his pack and pulled out a weary and tattered book, the Space Paleontologist's Guidebook. Apollo never left home without it, the collector's Bible. Flipping through the pages, he stopped about halfway through. "Yes! See, look here, at the curve of the base and the angle of the upper maxilla. This is a Bobosaurus," he said, showing the page to Evie. She clapped her hands and squealed. Her level of enthusiasm was bubbled, her cheeks pressing toward her narrow and brown eyelids. "A Bobosaurus!" the teen girl exclaimed. "And in such great condition!" Brody bobbed his head. "How much do you think it's worth? How much coin?" That was always his question. Coin, money, exchange. Could he use it for barter? This was a point of constant debate between the brothers. If Apollo had his way, they'd never trade anything off. Every discovery would be stashed or placed on display. Shelves and shelves of the things, placed in a room, or multiple rooms, where he could look at them and enjoy them at his wish. Brody would prefer to sell everything. He and Apollo were both hunters, true, but of a different sort. Apollo hunted bones, history, the past. Brody hunted the bargain, a good deal. That is where his passion lay. They both loved the dig. In that they were the same. Once they found something, well, that is where they differed. "It doesn't matter how much it's worth," Apollo said, picking up his brush again. "Come on, just tell me, how much?" the younger brother pressed. "It's worth what it's worth," Apollo replied flatly. "Oh, that means it's worth a lot, doesn't it? I can tell. The more guarded you are, the more we can get at the exchange." Brody's enthusiasm now matched that of his sister. Just help me dig it out, all right? We can decide what to do with it later. The siblings agreed and set to work. A short while later, they had safely uncovered the section of jawbone. It wasn't complete, of course. It never was. That's not how sandy bones work. All the same, it was a wonderful find. A prize. It would fetch a good trade, if Brody were able to convince his older brother. As the orange sun neared the horizon, the group decided to head home. Mother and father would be waiting. Apollo could picture them as he walked. He imagined that father was resting from a long day in the arena, wrestling beasts for spectacle. Mother was probably tending to one of his latest wounds, telling him that he should have become a doctor instead. The idea was laughable. Dad hated doctors. Evie stopped near a small bush. "Here, little fella," she said softly. "Oh no, not more of those gross things," Brody complained. "Sand lizards are not gross," she spouted. Then she stood, lifting her hand. "And look, she has a friend." On her hand were two skinny reptiles, 6 legs each, 2 tails, and a head that swiveled side to side. Apollo offered his backpack and unlatched a section intended to keep lunch cool as they walked through the desert heat. This cooler contained no lunch, however, but close to a dozen similar sand lizards that Evie had caught. She dropped one into the pouch. The other clung to her finger. It had an incredible grip. "See, that's just weird," Brody said. "It won't let go. Those things are impossible to get off once they do that." "Not weird, not impossible, just tricky." Evie then relaxed her hand and stroked the lizard's back. After a minute, the reptile released its hold and slid into the pouch. "See?" They continued walking for a short while, Evie performing an occasional cartwheel. "What is that?" Apollo said, pausing as they crossed over a sandy dune. In the distance, a medium-sized spacecraft had landed in between 2 dunes. "A fighter jet," Brody said. Apollo narrowed his eyes. "No, that's not a fighter jet. It's too fat. It looks like some kind of transport carrier. But what would it be doing here?" "Let's check it out," Brody said eagerly. "We should get back home," Apollo suggested. Brody groaned, then tried another tactic. "They might be lost, or stuck. Think about it. A transport out here? Come on, they might need help." Evie grinned. Even if Apollo didn't see what their younger brother was doing, she did. Brody was getting his way by appealing to Apollo's gentle nature. Apollo wavered, considering it. "Let's just take a closer look at least. What harm could it do?" Brody pressured. Apollo cleared his throat and looked up. "All right, a closer look." The 3 changed their pace and began a path toward the mysterious ship. Chapter 2. "It looks like they're taking something out from that pit," Evie said as 2 men walked across the dune, nearing a cargo ship. That was no strange fact. There were pits all over the place on Nielsen 5. People dug. Sometimes they found something. Sometimes they didn't. "I wonder if they found anything interesting," Apollo said. They saw a group of men carrying metal boxes from the pit. That was strange. As the 3 teenagers were about to cross the last dune, Evie grabbed her brother's arms and tugged. "Hey, what are you doing?" Brody said with a scowl. She pulled them down low. "Look, that last guy." Apollo spotted it. A blaster rifle was slung over the man's shoulder. The teens lay flat on their stomachs, the sunset providing just enough light to see. "Their clothes are weird, too. No sun cloaks. And why are they wearing masks?" Brody wondered aloud. Each man had a plastic and jagged mask covering the lower half of their face, hiding their mouths. Unusual. "Yeah, they don't look like dusters," Apollo said. Dusters was a common slang term for someone searching for bones in their region.
So who are they?
Evie said. Not sure, but something tells me those aren't bones in the boxes, Apollo said quietly. The three watched on for a minute longer as the men transported the cargo from the pit into the ship. Suddenly, a voice shouted at them from their side.
Don't move!
They froze. A man, dressed in similar dark clothing, with a mask, stood only 15 feet away atop a nearby dune. He had a blaster rifle leveled in their direction.
What are you doing here?
The man asked angrily. He had a strange accent that Apollo did not recognize.
We saw your ship and wondered if you were lost. We came to... Apollo started. Nice try, thieves!
The man took a few steps closer.
Hey, we aren't thieves,
Brody defended.
Enough! On your feet, slowly. Let's take a walk.
He motioned for them to descend the dune toward the ship. Brody bit his lip. Apollo could tell that his brother was not happy about the command. Neither was he. But for now, they had no choice. Just do what he says. It'll be all right, Apollo promised in a whisper. Brody contained his anger. They trudged down the sand hill, arriving near the ship and the pit.
What do we have here?
One of the men asked as he exited the ship.
I found us a couple of thieves,
replied the man with the blaster.
We are not thieves,
Brody repeated.
And don't you mean a few?
Evie asked with her eyebrow raised.
What?
The blaster guy said.
Well, you said a couple of thieves. That would imply that there were two of us. But there are three, she said, whisking her hand in front, motioning at the three of them. So I think you meant to say that you found a few thieves, not a couple.
The man just stared blankly at her. Was she serious? Evie continued.
Another way of saying it might be that you found a group of thieves. That might be easier, right? Then you don't have to quibble or think about how many thieves you found. Sort of a neat little lyrical loophole.
The man furrowed his brow and hunched, becoming annoyed.
Or an even better way would be, Stop it, he interrupted. I don't care about this. Enough of your word games.
Evie shrugged a little.
Just trying to help.
Apollo tried his best to hide a grin. He was used to Evie. He knew that she was indeed only trying to help. That made it all the more funny in his eyes.
They don't look like thieves,
the man from the ship said. Apollo guessed that this guy was in charge. His black button shirt fit tightly against his frame, and he had patches on his shoulder. Apollo had no idea what they meant, but in general, it was a rule that people with patches could boss around patchless people. He must be important. Think about it. If two random strangers approached and asked you to do something, one a person with patches and one without, who are you going to listen to? Patches. Every time, patches.
Maybe they are spies then,
the blaster guy said, squinting his eyes suspiciously. Patches took a step forward.
Is that right? Are you spies? 3 young spies sent to report on us?
The way he asked the question told Apollo that he didn't believe it himself. It was a game. Patches knew they were not a threat. At least, he was pretty sure. We are not spies. We are not thieves. We are dusters. That's it, Apollo said calmly, clearing his throat. Patches leaned back. He was thinking.
Dusters?
He asked curiously. Apollo was learning from the man, reading him. He had a few deductions already and was becoming more sure of his guesses. First, the men were not from Nielsen 5. Dusters was a common term. Everyone knew what it meant, but this man did not. Second tip-off was the clothing. It was from another planet, another part of the cosmos, likely. Apollo had never seen fashion like it, and frankly, it was a terrible choice for the desert. These guys were sweating and uncomfortable. If they knew about sun cloaks, they'd be wearing them, patches or no patches. On top of all that, the strange accent was shared amongst the men and was foreign. Another point of interest was the boxes. Bone collectors don't use boxes like that. Not in his experience. All of the boxes were the same size. Bones didn't work that way, coming in all different sizes. No way a Yodosaurus femur was going to fit in a box like that. In short, these guys were not digging for bones. They were digging for something, but what?
"Last one, boss,"
A guy with a higher pitched voice called, a box in tow, headed for the ship. His eyes were trained straight ahead. He hadn't noticed Apollo, Evie, and Brody.
"We better hurry, too. The commander wants these minerals fast. We've been running behind."
Minerals. Commander. Indeed, not bones.
Good. Load it up. And let's get a move on. I'm sick of this place,
Patches said. He turned and walked away. For a moment, Apollo thought they were in the clear. Patches believed them. He would just let them go. Apollo was wrong.
"What do we do with these dusties?"
Blaster Guy asked. Dusties? That was annoying. Without turning his head, Patches muttered,
Toss 'em in the pit and cover 'em up.
Chapter 3.
"Just let us go,"
Evie cried out.
"You don't need to toss us into the pit. We didn't do anything."
The guy with the blaster gun smiled. Apparently, he was fond of the idea.
You heard the boss. Into the pit,
he said with a growl.
"Wait,"
Apollo started. "We aren't causing any trouble. We aren't spies, and we aren't thieves. We haven't done anything wrong. You guys can just fly away. Just go." He was trying his very best to stay calm, but deep inside he felt his gut turn and twist. He was the older brother. It was his responsibility to take care of Evie and Brody. It was his fault. They should have gone straight home. Should have never messed with these strange visitors. Patches stood next to the ship. He turned and looked at the youth.
I have considered your proposal, and it has been denied. Thank you much for the suggestion. Now then, into the pit.
He was about to enter the ship when Brody opened his mouth.
"How about a trade?"
Brody called. A trade? Patches had not considered this possibility. The teens might have something of value. Interesting. Interesting enough to investigate.
What is it you have to offer?
Patches asked, taking a step forward.
"Something worth a lot of coin. We give it to you, and you let us go. Nobody gets hurt. No pit."
Brody lifted the backpack from Apollo's shoulders. He held it up, enticing the men with his offer. The mystery. What was in the bag? Apollo leaned in close. In a whisper he said, "What are you doing? Don't give them the jawbone. They'll just take it and throw us in the pit anyway."
"Trust me. Let me do my thing,"
Brody whispered back. Then, in a slightly louder voice, he said,
"It's worth a lot. They might take the trade."
Even now, he was bargaining. Apollo held his tongue. Brody was a skilled tradesman. This would be a great bit of bartering, if it worked. A bone for their collective lives. At this point, there were 4 men. The guard who'd found them, Patches, and 2 workers. One of the workers had a blaster on his belt, along with some sort of heavy flashlight. The other worker had no belt. Maybe it wouldn't fit around his wide waistline. The 4 men gathered around the pack. As they neared, Apollo expected his brother to open the large pouch which held the rare fossil. But his brother surprised him. He instead unlatched the cooler section. With a wild motion, he shook and jerked the opening at the 4 men.
The sand lizards were ejected from the pouch, landing squarely on the men's faces above the mask section. The creatures took hold, frightened by the sudden movement. Patches and his men began to scream, flailing, disoriented, and disgusted. "Run!" Evie shouted, turning away from the group. Apollo did not hesitate. He turned with his sister. Brody tried to turn, but one of the men grabbed his wrist. Brody pulled and tugged, but the man had a grip. It was the guy with the holstered blaster and the flashlight. He had one hand held on Brody and the other scratching at his own face. Brody reached for the blaster, but the man turned, a result of his frantic effort to remove the panicked lizards. Brody caught hold of the flashlight instead. It was heavy, metal. It wasn't a blaster, but it would do the trick. With a giant swing, Brody smashed the flashlight against the hard end of the man's knee. The guy wailed in pain, and Brody was free. "Let's go!" Apollo shouted. Their feet pounded the sand. A blaster shot skimmed the rim of the dune near them as they cleared it, but soon they were on the other side. "Don't slow down! They might chase us!" Evie yelled. They didn't slow down. Their sand shoes were tailor-made for the job. Their sun cloaks flowed as they sprinted on top of the soft sand. "What are these things?" one of the men yelled. "Dwarf snakes with legs," Patches called back, ripping the last one from his cheek. He began a chase, running toward the dune, but his boots sank in the warm sand. It would be slow going for him. After only 10 steps, he stopped. He knew he could not catch them. His men, only now freeing themselves from the 6-legged sticky lizards, caught up to their leader. "What do we do now, boss? Chase them?" one of the men asked, rubbing his injured knee. Patches exhaled and looked at the falling sun, which was now nearly gone. "No." "But, boss." "No," Patches commanded. Patches was no genius, but he was a pragmatic man. That was part of how he rose to his current rank. It was why he was the leader of this mission, and not one of these buffoons. "We gain nothing by chasing them. We won't catch them on foot. Even if we load up and track them in the carrier, it'll be too dark soon. They could hide in one of them pits. No, it's not worth it. We got what we came for. We need to deliver to Mr. N. Like you said, we've been running behind as it is." The other men looked at each other, but said nothing. The decision had been made. Their leader had spoken. A short while later, many dunes away, Apollo, Evie, and Brody relaxed as they watched the carrier take off and rise into the sky. The three leaned against a hill, still catching their breath. "That was some quick thinking, Brody," Apollo said. "I told you, I have a talent for trading." Apollo chuckled. "I feel bad for those poor sand lizards," Evie said. "Do you think they are okay?" "Lizards are tough," Apollo said with a shrug. "I am sure they are better off than those guys are." After a minute, they stood and readied themselves for the return trip home. "We better get moving. It's getting dark," Apollo said. Brody smiled. "Good thing we have this then, right?" He lifted his hand, which held onto a heavy metal flashlight. "You stole the guy's flashlight?" Apollo asked. "I keep telling you, I have a talent for trading." Apollo laughed, and they made their way home. The walk seemed to pass quickly, the three talking about the evening's adventure as they went. "You need to see a specialist, a therapist about your shoulder," Mother said, hovering over Father. He was seated on a stool, hunched as the youth entered the little home. "Bah," their father muttered. "Those quacks don't do anything. Rubbish." Mother rolled her eyes and flicked her hair. "Wash up. You are late for dinner," she called. The three did as they were told.
Brody set the light down at an end table as they sorted their things before eating. Apollo lifted the heavy metal item. "I think you might have busted that guy's knee with that smack back there," he said.
"Serves him right."
Apollo studied the flashlight. It was interesting, not like any he'd ever seen before. He inspected its construction. Whoever had fabricated the tool had a talent for the work. It was well made, no doubt. He twisted the top end and was surprised to find that it shifted. He twisted again. It gave way once more. Then a click. Then the lower half of the flashlight fell to the floor.
"Hey, you broke my new light,"
Brody worried. He scrounged and picked up the bottom piece. He lifted it, then a curious look came over his face.
"Look," he said. "It's hollowed out, and there is something in here." "A piece of paper?"
Evie said.
"Yeah, but it's weird. Like it's made out of cloth, and there is writing on it," Brody mumbled.
Apollo took a step closer.
"What does it say?" "I'm not sure. The writing is tiny. I can't make it out,"
Brody answered, twisting and turning the cloth. Evie grabbed it.
"Look, the shape."
It was round, nearly identical in size and diameter to that of the flashlight top. She placed the cloth atop the lens and activated the light. An image appeared on the wall next to them. Bigger, a projection.
"Whoa," Brody chimed. "So cool."
Apollo studied the numbers, the writings, the drawings.
"It's specifications, a diagram," he said. "For what?"
Evie asked.
"Well, I think for a ship. But that can't be right," he said, confused. "What do you mean?" Brody said. "I mean, no ship could be this big. It's impossible. It can't be right."
The three studied the diagram for a moment. Then Evie asked,
"What are these numbers here?"
Apollo studied them, then looked at his siblings.
"Those are coordinates. Probably the location of this thing, if it's real."
Brody glanced up.
"Guys, if this thing is real, then..."
Apollo nodded. "If it's real, then we need to get this info to the USSA immediately." Evie scanned more of the specifications, then said,
"Look, the ship has a name."
"What is it?" Apollo asked. She turned her head and looked at her brothers.
"The Goliath."
Thank you for listening to this production of The Dusters, a short audio story. Written and performed by Tyson Clayson, a human. This is one of 3 short audio stories on YouTube, along with Thunder and the Light Whips and Project Alpha. All 3 stories connect to the book, Slater and the Goliath, which is available on Amazon. Griff hopes you have enjoyed this story and thanks you for listening.